Sure. I'm so happy to be in conversation with you, and do hope that someday soon we'll be able to visit one another in person. So I am what's called a second career rabbi here. I started out for about 14, 15 years working in social justice work in the United States on a variety of issues, and came to the rabbinate in my mid 30s. I came to rabbinical school in my mid 30s and was ordained just before I turned 40. So um, I haven't been a rabbi that long. And I started out in California and served a congregation there, and then came to Brooklyn just 6 years ago to be the senior rabbi of Congregation Beth Elohim, or we call it CBE. And CBE was founded in 1861 by German Jews who'd come to America, and it was founded in downtown Brooklyn and eventually moved to our neighborhood where we are now, Park Slope, Brooklyn, in 1909. And the congregation had a classical reform founding, and it wasn't really till the end of the 20th century that it kind of moved out of classical reform and started to embrace some different aspects of tradition a little bit more. And now our services are almost entirely in Hebrew, and we embrace many different traditional aspects of Judaism, while also being really creative and kind of out of the box. We try to do a lot of things that are surprising and original, and open to the influences of our neighborhood and our community, which is really vibrant where we are. There are a lot of young Jews where we are, a lot of young people. There's a lot of arts and creativity, a lot of ideas, a lot of authors. And we have really become a gathering place for the whole community, where people come together to hear renowned authors who may or may not be Jewish and may or may not be speaking on a Jewish topic, who come together to experience the arts in one way or another, who come together for social justice causes. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that. And we also became a center for caring for children. We have a large preschool. We also have an after-school program and summer camps, and became known as a place for the children of the neighborhood, whether they were Jewish or not, to be able to come together. And in addition to our religious school, which is really only for our members and focuses, of course, on Jewish education. So that's a little bit of a taste about what we're like.
If we could perhaps just turn our attention to most recent events, really, because the pandemic, of course, has had an impact on both our congregations and widely throughout the world, really. And I'm really wondering, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on your congregation and sort of in the USA as well?
That was a fascinating history. Thank you for sharing it. And so many of the principles you spoke of are shared by our community as well. Yes, so the pandemic obviously has had a deep and heartbreaking effect on all of our communities. For the CBE community, we lost a number of members to COVID-19. We also had many of our members lose a relative. When the pandemic first hit, we very quickly were able to move online, and we didn't miss a Shabbat service. We right away, by the next Shabbat, we were on Zoom and streaming and on Facebook Live, and the community really shifted pretty quickly to be able to stay connected to each other that way. We started something called CBE Connects, by which our members reached out to other members. We made sure everyone in the membership was called several times to check on their health, to check on their needs. And our Chesed team really grew during this year, especially in the latter part of the year, to build our capacity to really care for members when they're ill or when they've had a loss or when they're celebrating, but to be able to help members show up for other members. Funerals and Shiva became some of the most heartbreaking things because people couldn't really gather in person, and the rules kept changing, but mourners were often really left alone. And we conducted many services over over Zoom and many Shiva Minyanim over Zoom, and tried our best to be present for each other that way. But that was pretty devastating. And now we are reopening. We have been, I have been leading from the sanctuary for about 6 or 7 weeks now, maybe 8 weeks. And we are in the month of June going to be fully reopening the sanctuary to the community for services. So that's pretty exciting. And it also creates a whole new set of challenges around vaccination status and negative test results and children who are, not yet vaccinated, and kind of navigating all of those complexities. But we're hoping to be able to be really largely in person while also having an online component for High Holy Days in the fall.
But you also, if I may just say, closed down in a very, very turbulent period in terms of the political leadership in the United States. And I just wondered how, I know your community and you personally responded quite dramatically and vocally to the leadership, the political leadership in the States over the last 4 years.
Yes, I would love to tell you about that. I want to speak in connection to something you just said about the pandemic. We also have had the experience that there are people who are connecting differently and maybe even more readily online than in person, either because they're far away or because it fits them better. And that's going to be really complicated when we return. There are also huge numbers of people who just stopped participating because for them it was an in-person experience. They just did not want to pray on Zoom. And but our lifelong learning, also our adult learning programs, we had people from other countries participating and all around the country. So we share that. And also our version of Cheder, our religious school, pivoted so quickly and came up with so many creative ways to engage children that are dependent on the computer. And we're going to now have to leave those behind, which there's some loss there in coming back to be in person, but there's also so much gain. So that's the conversation we're having right now. But yes, so when Donald Trump was a candidate for president back in 2016, we already were working on a number of social justice issues that we accelerated when we saw that he might become president. One was we had a dismantling racism team that was focused on systemic racism in the United States, and especially around the criminal justice system, which is hugely disproportionately targets African-American people and Latino people. And so we already had that in place. And then also his rhetoric in his candidacy before he became president against refugees and immigrants caused us to create a refugee task force. That Sukkot of 2016, we dedicated our sukkah to the refugee experience and made it like a refugee tent and had educational information all inside about the global refugee crisis. And out of that emerged a refugee task force that became very, very large and very, very active. So at the time he was elected, we were already in motion. And I had been speaking about the danger of his candidacy and of his potential presidency very vocally. And I also personally was arrested several times after his election in civil disobedience about, for example, the Muslim ban and his threat to deport all of the children who came here as undocumented immigrants and had grown up in this country. That policy was called DACA. And so I personally was, and also family separation, where his administration separated children from their parents. I was also in a civil disobedience action around that. So I was personally very vocal and involved, but we also did something called Get Organized Brooklyn, which was, we opened our sanctuary doors to all of the people in our community who felt the need to respond to his presidency and the dangers he posed with action. And we, the week after his election, the day after his election, we opened the sanctuary doors for basically mourning, and people came for hours to cry and to share their fears. and we sang and we talked and we listened, and it was many hours of people kind of communally grieving what had just happened. And then a week after that, we gathered the first big communal gathering in response to him. It was standing room only. We have a 1,300 seat sanctuary. There was a line around the block, and it was also on Facebook Live. And the community galvanized. There were 40 working groups, and many of them became major engines of the resistance movement in New York, and even in some senses nationally. And that went on for the first year and a half of his presidency. Every few weeks to every month, our sanctuary was packed with people of all different backgrounds coming together to organize against, his dismantling, his attempt to dismantle the healthcare system, his attempt, his attacks on immigrants, his attacks on Muslims, and then also winks to the right wing to in their anti-Semitism, and his attacks on the free press. There were so many different things to focus on at the same time. His attacks on women. So we had just a huge mobilization, and then that group became a group that focused on trying to elect Democrats in the midterm elections. And at that point, it had to remove itself from our synagogue because we're not allowed to work on partisan electoral politics, and it became a separate entity. But we really kind of birthed that in our congregation, and then for the rest of his presidency, we spoke out, we protested, we continued our dismantling racism work and our refugee work, and then did a huge effort around voter registration for the next presidential election. And many of our members just were incredibly active for many months trying to get everybody to the polls. And gratefully, he was not reelected.
And how is it different now? I mean, is there a palpable feel of difference?
Yes, immediate relief. And this is, I think, at this point, it is less a partisan question and more, he represented and represents still. He continues to say that he won the election. I just read that it's about 15% of Americans still believe that he won the election. More than 50% of Republicans still believe that he won the election. And though many people are moving away from that, and therefore from the Republican Party, because there's a real kind of struggle happening within the Republican Party around whether to continue to be in allegiance with that lie, which it is just, at this point, all experts agree that it is a lie. But so he has represented a threat to democracy in America. It's not just a question of, are you a Democrat or a Republican? It's a question of democracy, and even in terms of his whatever relationship he had with Vladimir Putin, like real question of kind of loyalty to our own sovereignty. So at this point, for many people, it's just a question of patriotism to oppose that, not a question of partisanship. And we continue to work on those issues, and I think everyone continues to worry about what he unleashed here and what kind of future it might have. It's so important what you're saying, and it makes me think about a teaching by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs from your country, Zichrono Livracha, who talks about this portion in terms of leadership, and talks about this moment of crisis you were referencing, as a question of technical versus adaptive leadership. Have you seen this teaching of his? Where he talks about the Exodus experience being really one that it was more required technical leadership, in which God was really giving instructions, and Moses could follow the instructions, and the people could follow Moses, and they could make their way out of Egypt just by relying on the external direction. But the wilderness, with its changing conditions, required them to be able to adapt in a way that the people just did not have the capacity to adapt that quickly to that many changing conditions.
Mm.
And Moses begins to be fed up with having to lead them because they're limited in that way. And I do think that part of what we're seeing right now is a huge requirement for adaptive leadership. Certainly, as we just talked about with the pandemic, having to pivot in the way we did, and entirely do our communal work in a new way. But also in our societies, which are changing so rapidly, as globalization happens, as economies shift, as migration happens, as the climate challenges happen, societies are under a great amount of pressure because of the rapidity of change. And we require leaders who have the qualities you speak of, for sure, because those are eternal and will help any leader be have the integrity they need in difficult times. But also we require leaders who are capable of adaptive change, who can pivot, who can move in the moment and see what the moment requires and speak to people in a way that responds to what is shifting under their feet. And certainly in the United States, that is happening. And you asked about the relief. I mean, we do see this president now being incredibly expansive and visionary in terms of the ways that he's responding to the moment. And also he has, I think, kind of is universally seen as having some pretty strong character. And so that is a huge relief for us when we had the opposite. And there really is a question, I think, in many countries right now: are we going backwards or are we going forward? And are we going to try to become more narrow and go back to some imagined ideal past, or are we going to embrace a more diverse future, a future in which we need to adapt to a changing economy and to a changing climate, and to a changing population? That's really at stake, and I do think this Parsha has a lot to teach us about that. Well, in the interest of time, I'll just say that I could say the very same things that you just said. Brooklyn tends to be a place where when the anti-Semitism flares up in the United States, it often happens here. Some of the most street violence happens here against Jews, and I completely agree with your prescription for what is needed. That we need greater nuance. We need people who really are fairly ignorant about the complexity of the situation to meet Israelis and Palestinians who are working for coexistence and shared society, and have been for decades, and to understand that the only future there is a future that is for both peoples. So
absolutely. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
I wonder if we might want to, even though we had another question we were hoping to get to, if we might want to wrap up with that. And
yeah, I mean, I think it is an important question, although it'd be lovely to have part 2 of this conversation. But I mean, well, let me ask you, because I'm sure that, again, some of my answers will be replicated, is that what are the most urgent social justice issues that you're facing at the moment? And I'm thinking particularly, we're speaking almost exactly a year after the murder of George Floyd. So maybe you'll say something about that.
Yes, that I think is widely understood to be the most urgent and important social justice issue in this country. Our country, unlike yours, was founded on the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of African peoples. And we have never reckoned. We have never held ourselves to account, and we have never made reparations. And we have never, because we've never done that, its lasting effects permeate every aspect of our society. And there's a really large literature coming out now, which is so important, analyzing the ways in which it shows up in so many different aspects of our society and in us, that racism. And so we at CBE have the Dismantling Racism team, which I mentioned, which works on systemic issues. We also now have an anti-racism project for looking inward, to look at our own community, to look at our own ourselves, to look at our culture, and the way that we can become an anti-racist congregation in which Jews of color and people of color feel embraced and welcomed and that they belong entirely, and that we are actively an anti-racist institution. So yes, it is front and center, and it's happening in many sectors of the society, and certainly in many synagogues. That same process of reflection and examination and an attempt to deeply change. Well, Rabbi Alexandra Wright, thank you for this time. It's been such a delight to talk with you and to think about how many similarities we have between our two communities, so many points of connection.
Absolutely. And thank you to you, Rabbi Rachel Timoner, very much indeed for your time. And I look forward to meeting you in person one day.
May it be soon.